Welcome to the Boomer Briefing Podcast, where we help you solve a critical business issue in 20 minutes or less. I'm your host, Jon Hubbard, shareholder here at Boomer Consulting. And with me today is Jim Boomer, our CEO. Jim, thanks for being on today.
You bet. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And so I've heard you talk recently over the last couple of months about the spatial web. And, the theme of this episode is what firm leaders need to know about the spatial web. So first question for you, what is the spatial web and why should firm leaders be knowledgeable about it?
Well, that's a great question, John. And, to be completely honest, when I started to hear about the spatial web, that was exactly the question that went through my mind was, what is this and how is it different from the web as we know it today? And as I did a little more research, what spatial web, it's being referred to as Web 3.0. And so if we think about the way we interact with online sites and the web in general, it's really in a two-dimensional space. And when we get to the spatial web, we start to see more of a 3D immersive environment. And so, you've probably heard of Oculus Rift and the headsets that will allow you to interact and engage in a virtual reality environment. These have been around for a while, primarily in the gaming world, but now they're starting to enter into more areas of life, including business. So, major companies, Facebook, Google, Apple, are all investing big in technologies to take that, what honestly is kind of geeky, nerdy thing that people can't fathom themselves wearing around into something more fashionable with glasses, even contact lenses that will allow you to, we know Google Glass was out several years ago, but it's refined from even what that was. And so, this is the next wave of the web that will not only be able to download a copy of content locally, but rather interact with an actual object and it feel real. Like our avatars will look like us, they'll move like us, they'll have facial expressions like us. And so it's pretty cool to think about. And, I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about it, but we dipped our toe in this with our event last year. Not quite the Oculus headset, but the immersive 3D environment for our summit in August of 2020. And it was nerve-wracking, but then once we got going, it proved out the fact that this is a way to not actually be in person, but feel like you are in the same space.
Right. And I think the pandemic probably accelerated the spatial web forward a bit, I would imagine, with more people being virtual and finding new ways to engage with each other virtually. So sometimes when we have these kind of futuristic topics, Jim, it can be challenging for firm leaders to kind of know, well, how do I, maybe learn more about that? How do I experience it? How do I start to understand it a little bit more and see how we could actually use it in our firm? So what kind of recommendations or solutions do you have for our listeners to, learn more about this, possibly experience it and kind of see for themselves?
Yeah, you bet. And that's what I had to do on my journey too, but I'll start with, I think talking about why it's important first for firm leaders and leaders in general to be aware of this and get a little more information. And really what it boils down to, we all know the pace of change in our world continues to accelerate and it gets faster and faster and faster. And when we think of the pace of change, we often think of technology first, and that's true, but we're also seeing the pace of change in consumer expectations, and market acceptance of new ways of delivering products and services, which you alluded to. You know, the pandemic probably took it, fast forwarded us 5 years in not even a full year. And so, you know, understanding these alternative delivery methods like spatial web became a whole lot more important in 2020 for several reasons. You already alluded to one, the pandemic accelerated the adoption of virtual events, and people saw, hey, this can work. I can interact if it's done right in the right platform. But on the flip side of that, businesses and business leaders started to see there's all kinds of ways to reduce costs, which a lot of people recognize. But what they may not have been looking into is there's also ways to increase revenues with this too. And we'll probably get into that a little bit more here in a little bit. But you know, frankly, the software cost in these tools is so low cost and simple to install and get started that it's kind of a no-brainer that this is something that people should be aware of and learning more about. So, you know, what should people be doing? You know, as with any emerging technology, several years ago, you know, before a lot of people had heard of blockchain, we were out there writing about it, talking about it. And, you know, it's just now in the last year or two that we start to see applications around that, and it really, blockchain becoming real. We are in a similar state, but probably a tighter timeline for it to become real. And again, because of the pandemic and how quickly we move forward. But with any emerging technology, I mean, the place to start is educate yourself. So, and that's through research, whether it's articles, read case studies, attend webinars, do some online training on the topic. But with that said, that's going to give you, you know, kind of a foundational level, but there's really no comparison to trying to understand, especially spatial web, without trying it and playing around with it. And so, you know, as the name describes, it's creating a space, and it's immersive technology, and immersing yourself in it is the fastest way to understand how the capability can be matched with your own needs, but also your firm's needs for engagement with your clients.
No, that's great. So, you know, one question I usually ask at this part of the conversation is, all right, if the listeners kind of applied some of your recommendations, what are some of the results they could anticipate? I'm going to phrase that question a little bit differently here, because this topic, while it is happening today, it is a little futuristic as well. You know, Jim, from your perspective, where do you see kind of the biggest benefits to firm leaders or to firms kind of resulting from the spatial web?
You bet. I'm gonna start with probably the most obvious, but in my view, the least important. And I already mentioned it, but saving money on some of these costly expenses. I think when people looked back at 2020, they saw how much money they saved on airline, hotels, and if you were putting on events, the cost of the event meeting space. And I lead with that because often dollars gets people's attention. And so I'm not trying to write it off as unimportant and not something that you should be aware of. But I don't think that cost savings approach is the right way to really have a growth mentality about your firm and any organization for that matter. But it certainly is a benefit. So, but on the flip side of that, I already mentioned, you know, you could have additional services. So why? It's really because these technologies expand your market reach and your service offerings. So the virtual environment, and most of everybody out there has probably seen it, breaks down the barrier of geography. And so when you remove these barriers, you're free to think more creatively about, you know, new services and revenue sources that may not have been possible in the traditional environment. So, when I had to go travel 2 states over or across the country to be able to implement this new service line, it was way too much to really get your arms around. Well, now that you take that away, it opens the doors to a lot more possibilities. I think the other benefit is establishing your firm as an innovator, as a tech savvy organization. Imagine when you put forward these technologies that not a lot or no other firms in your market or in your area are using, how advanced and how again tech savvy your firm looks. And so that you start to build a very positive reputation for delivering services, events, whatever you're trying to engage with your clients on, in a very different but also still engaging environment. So I think there's a lot of benefits. And I alluded to our summit, and we saw them firsthand in leveraging the platform we chose, which was Verbella. And I already mentioned that it was the most nervous, but it was a great payoff. I mean, the first 2 minutes, I'm thinking, what are a group of professionals from accounting firms going to think about being in, a virtual world? And within 2 minutes, it was like, this is going to work. This is a no-brainer. And then the feedback was, for the most part, there were a few people who didn't click for them. But for the most part, people said it was the first time they felt like they were around their peers in months, because a lot of the virtual events had been still stuck in that 2-dimensional realm, which was hard to replicate the in-person feeling.
Right. And it certainly did provide a different feeling than just a bunch of, squares on Zoom. While it's good to have that kind of facial expression and body language and things like that, there was a sense of community and experience when you're all kind of in the same virtual environment together, which I didn't anticipate. So I see what you're saying there, Jim. The profession, and we talk a lot with our clients about this, about paying attention to things going on outside the accounting profession that are really relevant to the accounting profession, right? The accounting profession isn't traditionally on the bleeding edge of some of this. So do you have 1 or 2 examples where you see kind of the spatial web already being utilized outside the accounting profession?
Yeah, I certainly do. I mean, spatial web's certainly not a topic specific to accounting firms. This is available to and useful to any organization, and I think I alluded to earlier, as an individual too. There's applications to have a more engaging interaction. So a couple examples. I'm going to use 2 that if we think about the experience in, say, retail or real estate, I can't think of a lot more things, or buying a car even. I mean, that would kind of be in the same boat there. I can't think of an experience where my traditional mind thinks I need to be there in person to buy something. And I rewind a few years, and I used to be so opposed to buying even clothing online, because it was a pain to return, exchange, and you couldn't try it on. But now they brought down those barriers and made it easier. But here, like retail, if you could go feel like you're in the store and interact with objects, and even have a virtual avatar that was your measurements and size, and try things on and see it, your experience in buying clothing is going to be less like, well, I don't know, extra large, large. I'll take a guess, and if it doesn't fit, I'll send it back. Here, you could like actually interact and try things on. Real estate company, and I should say, retail companies are already investing in this. how can I have a virtual store that people can interact with my product, go check it out, look at it, and feel like they're there in a real store. And then real estate, like that's a hard one, because that's a big investment for anybody to, you know, whether it's commercial or it's your personal home, you're putting down a lot of investment in that real estate. But real estate companies are embracing this, because you can go into an immersive space that has replicated down to every detail what that office space or that home looks like, and you can go tour it. And it's opened up all kinds of opportunity in real estate. And so those are a couple that I put out there. But you know, I think companies like you know, auto companies are already playing with this too, of how do I have virtual showroom that I can go look at an automobile. And it goes beyond most of the websites where I have a 3D view and can spin it around and look inside. But your virtual being would be able to actually interact with the product. So you know, those are a couple examples. You know, I think the other opportunity, thinking outside of the actual accounting firm, but impacting the accounting firm, is there's going to be an opportunity to advise and lead your clients who are in all kinds of verticals, of ways that they can leverage this technology. So being knowledgeable of it is even more important, to take that kind of thought leadership role with your client base.
No, that is all great, Jim. And I think we will see more and more of those virtual experiences via the spatial web moving forward. So, Jim, if we have our listeners here, they're liking what you're saying, they're maybe being introduced to this for the first time, and they want that next step. What's your recommendation for them that once they hang up on this podcast, if they want to learn more, what's your recommendation for them?
Well, I kind of alluded to this earlier, but first and foremost, it's about educating yourself. The more you learn, the more you're gonna understand not only what the spatial web is, but how it can be applied to your firm as well as your clients' businesses. And so start your research, start educating, start playing with these things. You know, I mentioned the platform we used for our summit, Virbela, VIRBELA.com. And it does require a download of a local application, but there's a free world that you can play around and actually see it. I mean, hearing it, reading about it's one thing, but actually going in there and seeing how it plays out is pretty amazing. Spatial.io is another one that, you know, would be worth taking a look at. And as I said earlier, they're low cost, and, you know, some of them are even free to just go play around with and experience. So invest that time to learn. The other thing I'd say is, if you get stuck, I think there's a couple avenues that can help you create positive forward momentum. One would be, this really, for a lot of organizations, would fall into the innovation bucket. And I think people can get hung up on, where do we go? How do we make this real with emerging technologies? So it's really important to invest the time and effort to formalize your innovation process, identify the who's gonna lead it, not actually do everything, but lead it and create that culture where it's safe to innovate and try new things. And, you know, we've helped a number of firms go down this path and create some structure around innovation within their organization. So, you know, if that's a process you're looking to take on and to formalize, we'd be happy to discuss the steps forward with you. I think second is, don't try to go at it on your own or on your own organization, and tap into the power of your peers. Join a group where you have other forward-thinking, innovative organizations, and get outside your own four walls, because there are, as I mentioned, there are all types of organizations that are already playing with this, figuring out how it applies to their business, and in some cases, how it applies to their clients. And so you can fast track this by interacting, sharing, learning, gaining insight, experience, new ideas outside of your organization. Those would be the two, I think, action steps beyond education that I'd recommend.
Fantastic, Jim. And I have to give a plug for the Boomer Technology Circles. So as you think about that peer group, there's several peer groups out there, one of which you help create and facilitate is the Boomer Technology Circles. And I do know there are some members talking about this as well. So that could be a group to check out. Well, Jim, that's all we have for today's episode. Thank you so much for being on.
You bet. Thank you. It was fun.
And for those listeners, if you like this type of content, please subscribe. And we release a new episode every Tuesday morning. So stay tuned for the next episode. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you.